This report tries to examine how well-managed migration can help to address Africa's development challenges. It identifies key actions that can be taken at the national, regional, and continental levels to overcome barriers to intra-African mobility. And it argues that safe and orderly migration can contribute to economic growth. And in so doing, it can provide the impetus for structural transformation in Africa and unlock the potential of migration to contribute to economic development as well as the continent's development goals. As you quite rightly said, there are roughly around 41 million people who are currently international migrants from, to, or within the continent, but the bulk of those reside in Africa. And we know that as a fact, the intra-African migration as a potential catalyst for economic growth through income and revenue that it generates for taxes that migrants pay can contribute significantly to increased GDP per capita. And we've estimated that GDP per capita can rise from about $2,000 in 2016 to around $3,250 in 2030. And this is also reflected in the report in the significant growth in remittances. Of course, the biggest countries that receive remittances are countries like Nigeria. But for us, what matters is how these remittances are being productively invested within the continent. And we've seen encouraging signs about how more of that money can be better harnessed to promote enterprise development and growth opportunities within the continent.
Right, Junior, to what extent does this report take into account the change in the guard, away from what we saw in the States, away from populist movements? We have seen just last week, Italy, the Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, making it very clear that this whole Sicily being a refugee camp, it is about to end. To what extent does this particular report actually account for the receiving end of the immigrants ordinarily to Europe?
No, there are several myths about African migration. And what's been interesting about this particular report is that we've sought to challenge some of those myths, particularly as they pertain to intra-African migration, but also a little to extra-continental. And one of those myths is that migration causes unemployment in destination countries. Now, through our analysis, we found that actually socioeconomic indicators in destination countries where they had high levels of immigration did not actually worsen. Similarly, it's often argued that immigrants bring wages down. But in our economic analysis, what we found was, in fact, that the overall impact on wages is actually insignificant. It may be true to a small degree for low-skilled sectors where migration contributes to pressure on wages, but for semi-skilled and highly skilled sectors, that's not the case. In fact, through our analysis, migrants boost economic transformation in destination countries on the continent, and that sets the conditions that wages in the long term can actually increase. So I think there are certain myths which are perpetrated through the media, and I think the recent developments in Italy will maybe see the rise of some of these things. But the argument that migration is detrimental to destination and sending countries, I don't think holds up, at least in terms of intra-African migration. As you've already noted, for sending countries, transfers through remittances, which now account for the bulk of private capital flows to the continent, have risen very, very strongly. And although there remain concerns about brain drain and the outflow of workers in sending countries, I think the picture is actually very, very diverse when you start to look at the data.
Roy, another fascinating statistic that comes out here is the composition of women when it comes to the migration come 2017. In the year 2000 here, your report does highlight there were 6.9 million women. Fast forward to 2017, 11.6. This has jumped close to 47%. What could be the rationale here? What are your findings?
I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the work that we did, because I think very often governments, when they elaborate migration policy frameworks, they think about migrants as primarily men, Now, in the context of Africa, and what we've seen is, in line with population growth, more and more women are moving, and almost as many women are moving. The issue here is, though, that they are largely absent from the existing policy frameworks that exist both in the national level and at regional levels. And that is a challenge, and that needs to be addressed, because